So Iffy Signals posted a video or a series of videos in which he's doing some iron separation tests. And this particular portion is about the XP Deus II. And if you haven't already, you should subscribe to his channel. I think he makes really good content, really well thought out content. And he's doing these basically, above ground iron separation tests in which there's an iron nail that's elevated and then there's a non-ferrous target. And I know I've had some objections to these, but that's actually not the point of this video, not the point of my response. But basically he's swinging them over the XP Deus II, and it's giving like a non-ferrous tone, but the target ID is indicating, it's very low, it's in the iron range. So the target ID is indicating iron, but the audio response is giving something indicating non-ferrous could be there. So I wrote a comment, and I'm just going to read the comment. It is my impression that the Deus II really likes to average the target ID across a wider set of data, which gives it stability, but is also what causes it to be dragged down by the iron, and which is why it doesn't refresh as often as on other detectors. Like, the Deus II really likes to try and lock in on a single number, whereas say the Manticore likes to give you a series of numbers. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. Like, sometimes a series of target IDs can contain more information, but sometimes it's harder to make sense of. But anyway, since the numerical value of the discrimination setting acts as a tonal breakpoint while in the fast program, you can extract the real target ID of a target by raising the discrimination until the tone changes from non-ferrous to purely ferrous. So if you raise the discrimination to 70 and then the non-ferrous tone changes to iron, then 70 is the true ID. So, and that is not being displayed because of the heavily averaged target ID paradigm that the Deus II employs. It's a bit tedious to do in the field, but it's a method to get a better target ID and lower your odds of digging in iron faults in the field when presented with a target, etc. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the target ID displayed on the Deus II doesn't always match the internal analysis. Like, it's trying to give you one average number, but as you sweep over it, the tone indicates more of how it changes over the sweep. Like, it's more of a continuous set of information as opposed to an average set of information. So I'd like to discuss what exactly do I mean by all of this, and I'd like to do a demonstration video that will hopefully shed some light on it. All right, so what do I mean when I say the discrimination setting in the default fast program on the XP Deus II is a tonal breakpoint? Let me start up the XP Deus II. Here we have a Swedish silver coin. See if I can get it to focus in on it. From 1694. It's a 5 öre coin. Let's see if I can get the light correct so you guys can see it. Silver coin. Doesn't really matter what it is. So we're now in the default fast program. I'm going to lower the sensitivity a bit so it doesn't make as much EMI, but that won't affect the outcome of this test anyway. So, tonal breakpoint. What is meant by that? In the default fast, let's notice that this coin gives target ID of 79 pretty solidly. So a tonal breakpoint means if we go to, where's discrimination? Set at default 6.8. When it gives an internal target ID less than 6.8, it gives you a ferrous response. And when the target ID is greater than 6.8, it gives you a non-ferrous response. So what I mean by internal target ID versus what's being displayed, what I mean by that is the XP Deus II likes to give a very average target ID. So what it's displaying doesn't always correlate to what the machine is determining internally. So there can be a bit of a disconnect because XP Deus II, the target ID doesn't refresh very quickly. It tries to really lock on to a target ID and be very stable, which has its pros and cons. But for example, let's just see what I mean by a tonal breakpoint. So we know the target ID on this is 79. So let's raise this. Now we're at 75. It still gives us a non-ferrous tone because the target ID being reported internally is greater than the discrimination setting. And if we know it's a 79 and we raise it to say 83, you'll notice suddenly it becomes a Ferris tone. So that's what I mean by a tonal breakpoint. Whether the target ID internally being reported is greater or less than our discrimination setting determines whether the tone is Ferris or non-Ferris. And indeed, we can go back down to 78. And now it's non-Ferris again. So we can actually use this to deduce a target ID in a situation where we are suspecting that the target ID being displayed isn't correct, or that it's highly averaged. So when would it average? Well, it'll average when there's multiple targets present. So let's go with the classic elevated nail test. Do 6.8. Giving us our non-Ferris tone. But the target ID being reported is like a 7 or an 8. And we want to know, what is the real target ID? What is the machine figuring out internally that it's not showing on the screen, because it's the screen shows us a heavily averaged target ID. It's averaging these two targets, and since the iron nail is closer to the coil, it produces a much larger impedance vector, or a larger signal basically, which drags down the target ID. But then, if we know that the discrimination setting is a tonal breakpoint, whoops, I was actually already on it, not sure why so we know there's a tonal breakpoint, and we know that when we raise it above the true target ID, it becomes Ferris. So we're going to use that to deduce the actual target ID. We're going to raise it. We know the actual target ID of this coin is, what did I say, 79. So start at 70. Notice it's still giving us that non-Ferris tone. Now let's go up to 85. Now it's gone. So now we know the true target ID that's being reported by this machine is between a 70 and an 85. And we can actually zero in on it a bit more. Let's go 77. So it gives us the non-Ferris. So it gets a little sketchy. And then we go to 82. And it mostly vanishes. So now we know it's between 77 and 82. $77. And it comes through just barely. So we can say, obviously it affects the accuracy because there's multiple targets involved, but we can say that the true target ID is actually closer to the 77 than it is the 8 that it's displaying. Let me get the swing height correct. Hard to do everything all at once. But you see the target ID, oh, we got an 80 there for a moment. But in general, it's giving us that 7 or an 8. So what this allows us to do is extract the real target ID. And when I say real target ID, I mean the display target ID isn't very good on this machine. It's highly averaged, which has its advantages and disadvantages. It's advantageous on deep targets. It gives you a better idea on deep targets because it's averaging a wider range of information. Whereas say on the Manticore, it might bounce around a little more. And in general, you'll notice on Manticore and Minelab machines, it does bounce. But there's pros and cons to both, is basically my main point. Let's fire up the Manticore just for the fun of it. You know, sometimes a series of target IDs has more information than a single target ID. But also, and we're in the default fast. Let me turn iron on. You'll notice that this is giving us a much truer target ID. Also, a very clear audio response, indicating non-Ferris. You'll notice that on the 2D screen, it is off-center from the center line. So that's something to consider when searching for mass targets with Manticore. Is you shouldn't dig only center line objects unless you only want to dig coins that aren't challenged in any way by iron. But basically what I'm saying is, I'm not saying, you could maybe argue from the default that the target ID on the Manticore is a little more reliable in these unmasking tests than the XP Deus II, because the XP Deus II takes this really averaged approach, whereas the Manticore gives you a lot of bouncier numbers. Like there's a lot less consistency, but in that sense it allows you to view a smaller slice, which gives you a more accurate indication of the target ID of the target that is being masked or affected by a nearby iron. And I'm not really trying to say that one is better than the other. Both of these machines are on the cutting edge of physics, and there's pros and cons to each target ID paradigm. In this particular test, I would give a slight edge to the Manticore. They're both giving it the correct target ID, but on the Deus II, you have to sort of, extract it from the machine by adjusting the discrimination setting, which you can do, but it's a bit tedious in the field. So, but then again, the XP products are kind of designed so you don't have to look at the screen. Like the screen's sort of an afterthought. You can take this unit off, for example, and I don't want to do it. I only have one hand. I can kind of do it like that, but I have a feeling I might pop it off and drop it. But you can take this unit off and then go totally by your ears. On this machine, it's audio first. XP products, it's audio is everything on them. Whereas the Manticore, clearly, just from the design, the larger screen, they want you to look at the screen more. The 2D screen feature, they want you to use that more. The point of this video isn't to say which one is better. It's to show that using a technique with the XP Deus II, we can actually get a better target ID in these masking situations than what the screen displays. On depth, you'll find that the XP Deus II target ID being heavily averaged will give you a better indication of the actual target ID at depth, whereas you're going to get a lot more bounciness with the Manticore. So those are just things you need to keep in mind and, figure out which one appeals more to you, or if you're using both, you need to know of those differences. And it's not really about saying which one is better or worse, because they both have pros and cons. It's basically what I'm saying. Like they both approach target ID slightly differently, and there's situations in which one has an advantage over the other, or one, maybe displays a better target ID than the other. So just something to keep in mind, and just a technique that I noticed on the XP Deus II. This was a point of contention with another YouTuber in a prior video when I talked about false positives, is that when you go dig target IDs of like a 7 or an 8 on the XP Deus II, you're going to get a lot of iron. But you can reduce that false positive factor by using this technique to deduce the real target ID. So what I meant by these false positives was, on a general scale of 0 to 100, closer it is to 0, the greater probability it is that the target is iron. Digging lots of 8s without verifying internally that the machine's giving a higher target ID will make you dig lots of iron, which is problematic in heavy iron. So as of the moment, I do kind of personally prefer a truer target ID that the Manticore is giving, but to be fair, I've only used the Manticore a handful of times, so that's a very early opinion. And in general, I'm not finding, I've messed around with these above ground tests, and I'm not finding a whole lot of difference in terms of unmasking potential, but I am noticing that it's easier to get an accurate target ID with the Manticore as of the moment. But then again, if you don't look at the target ID and you just go by tones, then the XP Deus II is every bit as good as the Manticore. They're basically, what I'm trying to say is they're both so equal that these differences are more about how the machines are engineered, how they're coded, than it is, raw performance differences. They both have access to the same physics. They're both generating, an time alternating magnetic field. There isn't anything super special that you can do beyond that, other than how you write your code that expresses that information. And then that creates these slight differences. So I think a lot of these testers, what they're actually testing is small differences in how this information is expressed, rather than small differences in raw performance. The smaller a difference is, the more accurate of a ruler or a measure you need to extract those small differences. And I think a lot of what they're seeing, the differences between these two units, is simply how information is expressed. Like a lot of people don't know on the Equinox, like when I made that one video about that secret setting, what I was actually doing is I'm lowering the tone break, the same thing the way that the XP Deus II, the discrimination, acts as a tone break. And if you actually look in the manual of the Equinox 800, it says that mass targets can read up as a -1 or a -2 sometimes, which, name one YouTuber that has ever dug a -1 or a -2 on the Equinox in an attempt to find a mass target. I've never seen one. So my point is, it's very important to know the underlying physics of the situation because it informs you of how a detector is operating. And I do have some issues with these above ground nail tests. For example, the ground response, there's no soil here. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, then that makes the test perfect because then there's no soil to interfere. But these detectors are designed to operate in soil. The XP Deus II manual over and over says don't test it in air, for a variety of reasons. But basically, ground response creates a phase angle response on the detector. The phase angle is basically part of what they use to deduce the target ID or produce a function that outputs a target ID. So small differences in ground conditions can affect the raw performance of a detector. And that's one thing that is totally lost in these air tests, is how the ground affects the performance. So my real issue with these above ground nail tests isn't so much the tests themselves, it's the strong conclusions drawn by these tests. Like, you'll get a YouTuber swings one over it and one of them hits it and the other doesn't, and they say, oh, well, then this detector A unmasked better than detector B, when I don't think it actually, limitations in the methodology restrict such a strong conclusion. The reason why I do these above ground nail tests is because that's how I discovered this technique with the XP Deus II. I learned something about the machine and how to use it. I didn't, I'm not doing it for the purpose of determining which machine is better. I'm not against it categorically. Like, I'm okay if a tester does it and then draws a weak conclusion, like, an above ground test suggests this detector might unmask better, but we don't know in what soil conditions or, what limitations that this test might pose. And another thing that I hear is, like, there's a difference between 3D unmasking and 2D unmasking. The detector doesn't process information in 3 dimensions. It processes information in impedance vectors and it compares the magnitude of the 2 vectors. So the only thing that makes this test harder than a same plane test is that the nail is closer to the coil and produces a stronger response. So there's an equivalent test to this if we just got a larger piece of iron and put it on a 2D plane, on the same level, and it would be mathematically equivalent. Like, it would produce the same set of 2 impedance vectors. Each target has an impedance vector that it produces when you sweep over it. It's actually producing a series of impedance vectors, but it's measuring sort of the peak response. And that peak response is sort of where this averaging comes from. It's like how many of these impedance vectors are being averaged together. And if you're familiar with vector addition, how vectors work in the impedance plane, basically their phase angles will be averaged. And the same with ground. Magnetizable ground produces an impedance vector that is then averaged with the target's impedance vector. So I would be very, very, very hesitant to draw raw performance conclusions from something that doesn't involve soil, that, is very artificial. Like if you look at this nail, look at how corroded it is. So when this nail is in the ground, it creates a whole matrix in the soil of dissolved iron. So a nail in the ground is totally different from a nail above ground. That's also why I haven't cleaned this, is the mud kind of helps cake on some of this extra, they call it halo effect, this extra halo of iron. So that's missing from this test. That's a huge, huge variable that is not present. It's a limitation upon the test. It restricts its validity. It reduces the strength of conclusions that you can draw from it. That's the other thing I would like to stress, is that I wouldn't take, even though I do like iffy signals, I do like the tests that he's come up with, I personally would take an approach of extreme skepticism towards the results of these because there's so much artificial about it. There's so much missing. There's a lot of variables at play here, and that's basically what you should take away from this, is you shouldn't be drawing strong conclusions from tests like these. Okay, so I want to talk about the complex impedance plane really briefly in an oversimplified sort of way to demonstrate what I mean by impedance vectors and like how they average together. So this is the impedance plane. This is a complex, what we call a complex plane, meaning one of these axes is real and the other is the imaginary component. But if you're not familiar with math, just ignore that for right now. So the x-axis is our resistive component. This is basically eddy current resistance, the electrical resistance of the target in a sense. I'm going to keep this very simple. The y-axis, ignore my awful handwriting, is what we call inductive reactance, which is basically a measure of the magnetic response of a target. Some of this is going to be flipped upside down. So in other words, the more a target goes this way, the more resistive of a signal it is. And resistivity refers to sort of like the electrical conductivity of the material in a very simplified way. And then inductive reactance is whether it amplifies or reduces the magnetic field, the time alternating magnetic field. So we could think of more this way as being more magnetic, like a greater magnetic permeability, and this way as being less magnetic. So something like a silver coin is going to have high resistance, it's far further on the x-axis, and low magnetic permeability. So it's, because silver is not magnetic, it's a non-ferrous material. So impedance vector for a silver coin might look something like that. Whereas the impedance vector, we're going to do a bit of an adjustment here, for say an iron nail might look more like this. And then this angle right there, which we will call theta, is our phase angle. From the phase angle, it's input into a function that's mapped into a series of target IDs. So one caveat here that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to invert this vector for the nail and draw it there. The reason for that is if you graph the tangent function, I might be dipping too much into math here, but it looks like this. This is the graph for tangent. This is negative pi over 2, and this is pi over 2, which represents 90 degrees of phase. So I'm adding 180 degrees here because of the way the tangent function works, and this is derived using arctangent. So anyway, I'm not going to go too deep into that because nobody's here for a math lesson. So why do target responses average together? I've got to draw this a little bigger. Sharpie's maybe too thick. All right. So our silver coin looks like this. Our iron nail looks like that. And if you're wondering on the XP Deus II, on the XY screen, you'll notice that non-ferrous targets go this way and ferrous targets go this way. It's because what the XY screen is doing is it's showing you a series of impedance vectors and then drawing a line connecting them in sort of an animation. So the way that the two vectors are averaged together is by head to tail addition. So if we were to take this vector, the iron nail vector, and superimpose it on the vector of the silver coin, and then add it together, we get a new vector that points to there, and this is our new vector. So if this phase angle theta represents a target ID of, like, let's say 90, then this phase angle all the way here represents a target ID of, let's call it 10, or an iron target ID basically. But you'll notice that when these two vectors get averaged together, the phase angle gets drawn down. So the 90 can get drawn down to, say, like a 20, and now it becomes down averaged. It appears to be an iron object now that has been dragged down. And indeed, this can happen. Let me do another. If the iron nail is higher up, it's going to create a larger magnitude vector compared to our small. So the magnitude of this vector represents the strength of the response. It's actually a little more complicated because they're primarily using the inductive reactance to detect the presence of a target, but just bear with me. So we get our target ID of 90, and what did we say? This is a target ID of 10, and we add these together, and then we draw the new target vector, And suddenly that gets drawn down to almost the 10. Like the phase angle is very similar. So that's maybe, say, a 12. So basically, the way that these vectors get added together is why down averaging occurs on the target ID. This is like the most simplified way that you could interpret phase angles and whatnot, and impedance vectors. So on the non-adjusted impedance plane, this is typically our non-ferrous targets, and this is typically our ferrous targets. And then these are other weird things like graphite and ceramics, and we're not going to get into that because that's not really what we're after. But so on our complex impedance plane, this represents electrical response, and this represents magnetic response. So when we have a ground vector, magnetizable ground, it produces mostly a vertical, purely magnetic response. On the non-tangent adjusted graph, it would be down this way to represent more magnetic. But remember the tangent graph that we're doing a matrix translation, basically. It's a linear algebra technique. But just bear with me. I'm trying to simplify this as much as humanly possible. So this is a ground response for magnetizable soil. But then this would be a ground response from salt water, since salt is mostly electrically conductive. So that's why it produces chatter, is because it basically creates the electrical response that a detector is looking for. And you could think of, like, say, threshold as a circle. If a vector is too small, it doesn't break the threshold, and then it doesn't produce a response. So when you're changing your threshold, you're actually shrinking or expanding that circle, and the magnitude of the vector has to exceed that point in order to produce a tone. That's basically what our threshold is doing. So in the complex impedance plane, when let's say we have so you might wonder, why does a deep signal tend to average towards the ground response? Let's say we're really zoomed in here, and this is the ground response. And this is our deep target. It produces a very short vector. Well, now if we add these two together, head to tail, our new vector has this lower phase angle or lower target ID. So that's why, as this vector shrinks, you can imagine if this vector shrinks to 0, then it becomes only the ground vector. So that's why a deep target will fade towards iron or fade towards the ground response. But also, this is why the ground matters in terms of unmasking, because part of unmasking is getting an accurate target ID. So the ground is very important in this equation too, or in this process, I should say. So what this allows us to do in the complex impedance plane is we can subtract that vector. So let's just we have our target vector. This is a coin of some sort. And this is our ground response. If we add them together and draw our new vector, you see that the phase angle has been lowered. So we got a lower target ID. But then what we can do is we can move the whole axis up here, basically subtracting the vector. Like, this is our new origin, and then we use our target vector. We draw it. These are supposed to be identical. And what that does is it allows us to subtract this vector, thus performing a ground balance. So if we know the impedance vector that represents the ground, we can move the whole axis up. Another way you could think of it is like rotating to eliminate the phase angle that the ground produces. Just wanted to briefly go into the complex impedance plane and very briefly and very sort of roughly show what's going on.